Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a true crime timeline that's going to put us right in the exhausted shoes of frustrated detectives who spent a quarter of a century chasing a complete ghost.
We're looking at the Lisa Ziegert case. It's a story that really highlights the absolutely devastating emotional toll of a cold case, while also showing us the unbelievable evolution of modern forensic science. So let's set the scene, and it starts off chillingly normal. It's the evening of April 15th, 1992 in Agawam, Massachusetts. 24-year-old Lisa Ziegert is working alone at Brittany's card and gift shop. Everything is entirely routine. Right around 8:20 p.m., she rings up a transaction. She's literally only 40 minutes away from closing up at 9 p.m. And then, she just vanishes. No witnesses, no security cameras out on the street, no obvious suspect. When her coworkers open up the next morning, they're met with nothing but an empty store and this incredibly eerie silence.
But the silence didn't last long, because what those coworkers found was deeply disturbing. It wasn't just an empty shop, it was a chaotic crime scene. Detectives arrived to find overturned boxes, which pretty clearly indicated a violent struggle had taken place right there in the store. The back door was just standing wide open, and most terrifyingly, right outside that door, they found drag marks leading into a nearby alley. Now, the initial hope was obviously that Lisa had been kidnapped and was still alive somewhere, but looking at that physical evidence, detectives knew they were in an absolute race against the clock. Well, that agonizing race came to a horrifying stop just 3 days later. Less than a mile from the gift shop, a guy was out walking his dog in a wooded area. He stumbles upon these tire tracks carving right through the mud, leading deep into a really secluded, swampy clearing. And the second police followed those tracks, any hope of a rescue mission just instantly evaporated. The brutal reality of what they found out in those woods changed everything. They recovered a woman's body. She had been sexually assaulted and suffered multiple stab wounds. They were actually able to confirm her identity right there through a charm bracelet left on her wrist. It was Lisa. Just like that, this became one of the most high-profile, shocking murders in Massachusetts history. And the killer completely vanished without a trace, leaving investigators staring into a total void. 400. I want you to let that number sink in. That is the sheer, exhausting burden placed on these detectives in just the first year alone. They chased down every conceivable lead. Boyfriends, roommates, co-workers, complete strangers. Hundreds of tips flooded in, some pointing fingers at local husbands, others that were just bizarre and totally unhelpful. Over the next year, detectives manually cleared over 400 people. I mean, imagine the pure frustration of looking 400 potential suspects in the eye, knowing the killer might literally be sitting right in front of you, but you just don't have the proof to lock them away. Every single thread they pulled ended up being a dead end.
Now, you might be wondering, didn't they have evidence? Well, they actually did recover DNA from the crime scene. But you gotta remember, this was 1992. DNA technology was super primitive. Investigators couldn't just upload a swab into a digital database like we do today and wait for a computer to spit out a name. They were trapped in an era of manual suspect comparisons. They had to physically find a suspect, get a sample, and test it one by one. It was agonizingly slow. Compare that to today's rapid digital data analysis. Back then, they had the killer's biological footprint, for sure, but they had absolutely no way to match it to a shoe.
And because of this massive limitations, the case just froze. Years slowly turned into decades. And you can only imagine the immeasurable emotional toll this took on Lisa's family, while the killer just blended seamlessly right back into society. The case was even featured on Unsolved Mysteries, which brought in hundreds of new tips. But still, nothing. Think about Detective Ron Massey for a second. He dedicated years of his life to this single investigation. He eventually had to retire, walking away without ever learning who killed Lisa. It became this looming mystery that pretty much everyone believed would stay unsolved forever.
So, looking at this timeline, it maps out a really agonizing journey. You have the murder in 1992, followed by these long, incredibly cold decades through the 90s and 2000s. But then, look at 2015. The silence finally breaks. It literally took a quarter of a century for the science to catch up to the evidence that had been waiting patiently in the locker all those years.
The massive turning point hits in 2015 when District Attorney Anthony Galouni officially reopens the investigation. So why then? Because modern forensic science had finally advanced enough to offer a real, tangible path forward. They weren't just going to knock on doors and re-interview old witnesses. They were bringing the DNA right back to the forefront, using cutting-edge tech that Detective Macy couldn't have even dreamed of back in '92.
And the absolute game changer here was DNA phenotyping. So what is that? Well, instead of needing a direct database match to identify someone by name, this technology acts like a genetic eyewitness. It actually reads the genetic sample and predicts the suspect's physical appearance. Think about that. For 25 years, detectives were hunting a ghost. Suddenly, phenotyping was about to give that ghost a face.
And here is the exact predictive profile the lab generated from that crime scene DNA. The technology predicted the killer was a white male, with dark hair and brown or hazel eyes. Bam! Instantly, the overwhelming suspect pool of the entire state of Massachusetts narrowed into sharp, actionable focus. Detectives didn't just have a biological sample anymore, they finally had a physical description to hunt for.
Armed with this new visual profile, investigators marched straight back to those old, dusty case files. They started cross-referencing this physical description against suspects from the 90s who had previously refused to voluntarily provide a DNA sample. The tech let them filter out all the background noise. They whittled that massive list down to just 11 men, 11 names, 11 guys who fit the exact profile and had actively dodged giving their DNA. And one of those 11 names really stood out: Gary Shara. The tense climax of this 25-year hunt hit when police, using the focus profile from the phenotyping, legally compelled Shara to hand over his genetic material. They got a court order. Now, the catalyst was purely scientific, but the result? It was intensely psychological. The second Gary Shara got handed that court order, he knew the invisible shield he'd been hiding behind since 1992 had just completely collapsed.
Knowing a DNA swab would absolutely expose him, Shankara didn't even wait around for the lab results. He wrote this horrific confession letter. In it, he admitted the terrifying truth: he had become obsessed with Lisa after simply seeing her at the gift shop while buying a present. He laid out years of violent fantasies. He confessed to attacking her inside the store that night, abducting her, driving to those secluded woods, sexually assaulting her, and ultimately murdering her. After writing all this down, Shankara actually attempted suicide, but he survived, and police arrested him in September of 2017.
The final resolution to this incredibly long nightmare arrived in 2019. 25 years of dead ends, manual file searches, and unanswered prayers were finally put to rest. Gary Shara pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A cold case that pretty much everyone thought was entirely impossible to solve was permanently closed. It just goes to show that while human investigation definitely has its limits, the steady march of forensic science is absolutely relentless.
We celebrate the closure brought by DNA phenotyping, for sure. But let's take a real look at this timeline. For 2.5 decades, this killer blended perfectly into everyday society. You really have to ask yourself, if DNA technology had never evolved past those primitive methods from the 90s, would Gary Shara have just gotten away with murder forever? It's a pretty terrifying reminder of how deeply we rely on the continuous advancement of science to actually secure justice. Thanks for walking through this explainer with me.
If you want to hear true events, crime-related story, hit like and do subscribe Fear Labs 99, because the next story is even darker.